So along the way. And we are very excited. Oh, actually, Jan, we did have one more introduction, I think, Jeff. Jan, would you want to introduce yourself and just say where you're from, your institution or organization?
If you also feel free to use the chat at any time during the session. I'll try to help with the managing of those comments.
There we go. Well, maybe we'll just, I think we'll just go ahead.
Yeah, just go
because actually as usual, I made way too many slides for the time we have, but I'd rather dedicate it to talk to discussion. I think this is a lot of this is review for you, but we want to show you. Well, first of all, we wrote this book, and many would know this. Because as you mentioned, Mehdi, there is not that much out there that talks about nonverbal communication in organizational settings, particularly with respect to culture, and particularly with respect to contextualized communication. And so that's why we wanted to introduce this book. And as you know, about 70% of communication is estimated to be contained in the nonverbal cues that we have. So we thought it important to study this. So let me share my screen. And okay, let me see. Got it here. And we will get to, or was I sharing the screen the whole time? I don't know. Let me see. Here we go. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So this is the unofficial cover of our book, What Isn't Being Said, actually, and Culture and Communication at Work. And what we will be doing in these in these lunch and learns is going through the book pretty much chapter by chapter. So this chapter, chapter 2, is the secret code of nonverbal communication and sets out the model that is basically the foundation for all the chapters to follow. So Edward Sapir, who I understand is basically one of the fathers of the field of linguistics, said that nonverbal communication is an elaborate secret code that is written nowhere but known by all. And what did he mean by that? Well, we will go back to this quote over and over again, culture is communication and communication is culture, by Hall, because Hall also was an anthropologist. And he believed that culture was an adaptive system. So basically that as an anthropologist, he viewed that culture could be condensed down to behavioral patterns associated with particular groups of people, to routines or customs or people's way of life. And that it is within these groups of people that, as Sapir said, the secret code of nonverbal communication is known by all. And I should say, if there are any questions at all, please feel free to give me a shout out. I won't see your hands because I'm of the way my screen is. So just feel free to interrupt me verbally. No nonverbal at this moment, please. But okay, so we have Hall's perspective, and that's the anthropological perspective, right? And then interestingly, Triandis, a social psychologist, had his perspective, which then was melded with the other, that basically said that culture is a function of interrelated systems. And that through this framework of interrelated systems, we can understand culture and its relationship to the individual and collective actions, and then interactions, right, between people. So what are those interrelated systems that Triandis was talking about and that Hall also adopted in this very interdisciplinary view? Well, first of all, you have the ecological system. So it's our physical environment, resources, geography, hunters, gatherers, cultures, that type of thing, flora and fauna surrounding a people. The subsistence system would be the hunter-gatherer, the methods by which individuals in a society use ecological resources to survive. The socio-cultural system, which are our institutional behaviors, our family structures, norms and values and roles as they exist in society outside the individual. Then you have the individual system, so individual aspects of behavior, such as values and perceptions, attitudes, learning, and motivational patterns. And then the inter-individual system, right, which is the socialization system, child rearing, learning, social behaviors related to networks. And so what this culminates in is that our proposition that individuals who share a common language, who interact frequently because of shared physical locale, I guess at this point, no, it could even be virtual locales, and who have shared perceptions of rules, norms, customs, values, that is their subjective culture. They rely on and attend to similar nonverbal cues in the communication context surrounding message, relationship, space, and time. And within this shared subjective culture, behavioral patterns and customs, unstated assumptions, standard operating procedures are adapted. That's the anthropological perspective, right? And internalized among individuals such that distinctive communication patterns develop and become implicit and themselves are adaptive. So here is the basic model that we would like to lay out for you. You can see that these various systems, these 5 systems in the environment, are the environmental culture, right, that is affecting the sender. Yes? Someone had a question? Or I guess someone just came on the call. Okay. So you see that these are the systems in the environment that are affecting both, right, that culminate into the culture that is part of the sender's context and the receiver's context. And so what we will do in this presentation is we will work from the outside in. So first we're talking about these environmental systems, and then we're going to get to the 4 contextual domains, and then we'll finally get to the heart of the model, the very center of the model. Now, this relationship between the aggregate and the level and the individual level is a little bit confusing, I think. And Brennan and Salk and others have said that culture may be a group level phenomenon, but culture itself is enacted and sustained at the individual level through communication and interaction between actors in specific organizational contexts, right? So it's individuals who make up this aggregate culture. And it's the individuals who enact the culture at the group level. So context-dependent communication, we assert, is not only about how people convey information, but also about the degree to which they attend to and use contextual cues in their environment to reason and relate to others in social interaction. And so we would like to posit that this applies to every societal group, right? That we might be in which there's a need to communicate effectively, which is basically every group, national cultures, ethnicities, genders, generations, but also professions and corporate functional areas. So engineers versus marketers versus accounting. All of them have their encoded patterns, their implicit norms and values and ways of communicating. So in addition to values and norms and beliefs, each of these cultural groups may develop standard operating procedures, as I said, behavioral patterns and unwritten scripts allowing the members of the group to communicate with one another and be understood both verbally, and that's 70% of communication, non-verbally. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I guess we'll just go on then. So now we get to the contextual domains, with which all of you are quite familiar. So communication is a system linking individuals to the subjective, cultural, or ecological context in which they live. Again, it's working from the outside of the model in, bringing in that ecological context and our subjective culture. Can be divided into 4 key non-orthogonal components, right? Non-orthogonal just means that they can be correlated. So the message, relationship, time, and space domains of communication, as you all know, being so wise and in the ways of ICH so far. Okay, so now we're going to focus on, we discuss the environmental factors, right? And now we're going to discuss the actual domains. So in the message domain, we see that we have nonverbal cues that convey implied or inferred meaning, right? And people higher in context dependence tend to use implicit words or communicate indirectly, as you all know, relying on information or cues contained in the context. So for example, in the socio-cultural system, right, in the institution or family norms may give rise to certain cues and certain understandings of those cues. And the inter-individual or the social systems, right, the social behaviors and networks. And you can think of the use of silence. In many cultures, I would say maybe Western European culture, silence is in a very annoying void to be filled, right? In Asian cultures or in Japanese culture, silence might have 5 different meanings. And in order to understand those meanings, you have to be attuned to those socio-cultural systems, the inter-individuals or social systems, to be really able to interpret the cue in the way it was intended. Within the individual system in high context communication, people rely on cues in the internal context, information contained within the individual. In the nonverbal experience, cues or life experiences one brings to a social action. Because high context communication is indirect and implicit, listeners take a more active role than they do in low context cultures. In fact, it's imperative that they take that active role to try to understand correctly what is being said to them, right? They will engage in search and inference behind and beneath the words spoken in order to interpret meaning. Can anyone, or does anyone want to give an example if we're using those environmental systems, right, of how that then is filtered through the message domain? Does anyone, besides silence, does anyone want to give an example of some sort of communication cue or
Well, I don't know if it's right, but as you were talking, I was thinking of an example. I don't know if there's any
Yeah.
other Midwesterners on the screen, but so say you had dinner at some friend's house here in the Midwest, and you're chit-chatting afterward,
Yeah.
and I put my hands on my knees and I say, well, and everybody from my culture
Yeah.
understands that means, okay, it's time to wrap
Time to
up.
go.
You probably
Yeah.
should have gone about 30 minutes ago, and you need to stop talking so that we can leave.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. So that's interesting. Putting your hands on your knees, but you're exactly right. I've been at plenty of Midwestern church gatherings to know that that's exactly the case. You don't have to say anything, but it's time to wrap up.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Okay. So the relationship domain is another, you have contextual cues within this domain. I think we skipped it. There we are. The relational domain of communication context is defined by the unspoken relational cues that influence how people communicate with others, which is highly related to social and social cultural norms regarding role responsibilities and attention to status that are often taught in the household and reinforced in schools and the workplace. So such relationship indicators might include age, gender, ethnicity, job title status, how long the people have known each other, their interaction history, and how much they trust one another. Now, high context communicators will actively search for relational cues. And depending on the cue they have, oh, this is someone my long-term business partner, I trust them implicitly. You will treat them very differently than you might treat someone else who you have, with whom you've just formed a partnership, for example. Another contextual cue might be the extent to which the parties compartmentalize their personal relationships from their work relationships, or the specific versus diffuse involvement in relationships. And so Hall gives this example. Japanese, Arabs, and Mediterranean peoples who have extensive information networks among family, friends, and colleagues, clients, and who are involved in close personal relationships are high context. As a result, for most normal transactions in daily life, they don't require, nor do they expect, much in-depth background information. Low context people, on the other hand, compartmentalize their personal relationships, their work, and many aspects of life. Consequently, each time they interact with others, they need more detailed information, right? So among the high context people are all on the same page because they're always in each other's lives. They know what's going on, right? So they don't need all that background info. But low context people do. Anybody want to give an example of a relationship cue that is filtered from the environment through the relationship domain? Anything based on status, age, seniority?
Maybe.
I have oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Patricia?
yeah, that is the concept.
Oh.
Just, I think that as an maybe kind of respect in front of some people, some maybe supervisor, some lecture, something like that. In our culture, we try to stay with just with two hands in front of us. I cannot describe it clearly, but I think that in our culture, just we try to take our shoulders to to the people, or maybe nod our head and take our head in some lower level of thing, or
Interesting. Okay. Interesting. Depending on the status. Yeah.
Yes, just depending on status.
Very interesting. Patricia, did you have something to say? Okay, her square was highlighted before, so it's like Hollywood squares. Okay, let's go on to, so also, there is, a degree of face saving that goes on in the relationship domain. And so you have to ask, is the language performing an informative or more low context function, or is it performing a socially lubricative function, right? Greasing the wheels of those relationships so that they function more smoothly. And adjusting or adapting one's own communication style to the counterpart is a social and relational component explained by communication accommodation theory, which actually is going to be discussed in chapter 3 by Wendy. So it's the tendency for people to reduce interpersonal or group boundaries through communication responses that are similar or complementary with a counterpart's communication style. And last week, the last time we had a lunch and learn, Xiao-ping talked about mochi, how face work can be done without a single word being spoken. Right? You see the importance of relationship, or the value of relationship harmony and relational order and hierarchy. And it's my understanding that because of the nature of guanxi, and people in China may adopt very differential treatments toward those with closer versus distant guanxi, right? And they will treat them differently in terms of communication frequency, communication setting, whether it's private or public, in office or over the dinner, and the communication style in terms of demeanor. The time domain. Time is part of a sociocultural system. It's socially constructed and reflects cultural variation in pace of life, time horizons, temporal focus, and simultaneous versus sequential task involvement. So polychronic or higher context cultures would view time as fluid and have a more holistic and cyclical notion of time and events, influenced by nature, seasons, customs, and tradition. Again, those environmental factors influencing the domains of communication. As such, they tend to have more simultaneous information processing, a fluid attitude towards time, and view punctuality and deadlines as pretty much artificial constraints, as man-made constraints, right? Rather than human-made, which they will take priority. Monochronic or lower context cultures view time as a tangible commodity, controlled by the clock, and have a more linear and sequential perception of time, influenced perhaps by technology and industrialization, right? Those environmental factors influencing the domains of communication. As such, they process information in serial fashion, which is reflected in a segmented and sequential approach to clock time, schedules, and deadlines. So temporal communication in the time domain conveys a nonverbal message, but the meaning is likely to be understood only if the listener is similar to the speaker in terms of high or low contextualization. So you might find that for someone who is lower in context, being on time is a signal of respect, whereas being what they consider late is a sign of rudeness. For someone who is more high context on the other time, being on time perhaps means someone who's a little uptight. I personally hated it when I lived in the Midwest. I'm from Wisconsin, so whenever we would have a dinner party or party for people at church, I'm a person, I'm very polychronic. I'm always running late. And if people arrive, we had a dinner at 6 o'clock and they arrived at 6 o'clock, I was not happy. It was like, what are these people doing arriving exactly at 6 when the dinner's, when we said the dinner was at 6? And being late if someone was late, maybe it's because they were tending to the relationship in front of them at that moment, and that took priority, right?
In that respect, excuse me, Nancy, to interrupt.
Yes, please, Jan.
I'm Jan. I'm from France. I would like to add an aspect here. To be very polite in France, when you have an appointment, personal appointment, I must say, you must leave a quarter of an hour. You must, arrive to your host's house a quarter of an hour late to leave room for the people who arrange the things, if they have last minute arrangement to make, to be able to do it. So that's a tradition here. But we are very, being on time at business means respect, and rudeness is late, of course. But on the personal side, you must leave some room to the people if you are invited somewhere.
That's so beautiful, because that's just such a gorgeous illustration of contextualized communication, right? That you have to understand the social context. Being late means one thing, but in the business context, being late means another.
Yeah.
But unless you maybe had a lot of experience with France, lived in France, you may not know the difference.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Is somebody else had an example that they wanted to mention? Okay. I have taught a number of years in Tunisia. I taught negotiation, cross-cultural communication, but also so I was doing some reading and found this an example. And someone might say, "I will meet you tomorrow at 10 a.m. inshallah," right? Well, that could, that's loaded with many different meanings. It's an intention to meet, but it's also acknowledging unforeseen or events or opportunities that might come up. And it is the speaker's way of transmitting, and hopefully the receiver's way of coping with uncertainty and complexity in a very fluid time culture.
If I may ask a question.
Yes, please.
I have always been under the impression that in those cultures, time is conceived as something not in the realm of humans. Is that right?
Can you say that one more time? Not in the realm of units, did you say?
No, that time is not conceived as something in the realm of humans, of human beings.
Oh, in the realm of human beings. Yeah, it is. I think time is, let me go back up here, that time is very much is holistic and influenced by nature, seasons, customs, tradition. Maybe that might be the realm of humans a little bit more, but it's very much, like the sun rising and the sun setting. It's very much tied in with events, right? With nature, as you're saying, not necessarily, as you're saying, in the realm of humans. So that's why if they see a man-made deadline, right, in their date book or time on the clock, those are all man-made constructions, right, that take a lower precedence than their own understanding of where they are and their relationships are with respect to time. Yeah, exactly.
May I have a?
Yes, please.
May I have a, just as I found in this multicultural situation that I am living since 5 years, I found it power distance is also maybe more important to find what you want to play with time. Just when you are in a higher power, you can find it that you are not forced to be on time. But if you need something to go to some maybe offices to make some appointment, you have to be on time. And poverty stencil is really important to maybe to find a real time what's about the punctualization or something like that.
Yes, yes, exactly. And it's my understanding that in some cultures, the higher you are in, up on the hierarchy, however that is measured in that society, the longer, if you are hoping to meet them, the longer you will wait, depending on the difference in your status, right? Yeah. Chris?
Many of you know that I used to work at an agency that held a big summer institute, and the corporate culture and particularly the director were probably the most polychronic people I've ever met in my life. And we would call a staff meeting over lunch when the director, God bless her, would show up at 3:30. And it said, lunch is now. I didn't get up till 11. I was up all night, and this is when I'm having lunch. So this is when the meeting is. And it was a really interesting adjustment to realize calling a meeting at lunch meant being aware of when my director awoke and when she might believe lunch will be. And so it was like, okay, it's like lunch is broadly held.
How interesting. So not only were you having to deal with perhaps a difference in time and perceptions of time, but you were dealing with hierarchy there as well, because you had to adjust to her.
Yeah. I mean, I still like my lunch at noon. I'm sorry, I'm hungry. I get up at 5 in.
But you didn't meet with her then.
No, it wasn't my lunch. It was my meeting. So it was fun.
Okay, the space domain. The ecological or physical environment where we're located includes proxemics, which is our perception of space, and how we use space to communicate. The most obvious level is our physical boundary, right? You can stake your territory or communicate power by maintaining or infringing on another's invisible bubble of space, right? Or by choosing the corner office on the top floor. Less obvious is when the space communication works at the level of other senses. So it's not just physical distance, it's perceived by all the senses, right? Auditory space, thermal space by the skin, kinesthetic space by the muscles, if someone brushes up against you, and olfactory space by the nose even. These factors, such as the use of space, interruption, right? Because an interruption in speaking is you are entering the other person's verbal space, auditory space, right? Emotion, body language, again, entering their kinesthetic space. All of those come into play. So just as examples of differences in the meaning associated with personal space, in Latin cultures, people might share, people readily share space in communication. They might touch someone's shoulder, speak more loudly, use expressive hand gestures. You can tell I'm not even Latin, but I use a lot of gestures, are all ways of saying, I'm listening and engaged in this conversation with you. In fact, they may finish one another's sentences to show, simpatica. Yes, I'm with you. I understand.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
May I have a question?
Yes.
I'm curious about if maybe the angle, horizontal angle of maybe two people facing each other would be important also as a case of proximity,
You're absolutely right, and we do assess that on the IC Edge survey. Do you face the person with whom you're interacting directly? Do you face them directly? Do you look them in the eye? Or or we also ask attitudes. Do you think it's rude if someone does not face you directly? Is it a sign of disrespect if someone doesn't face you directly? And depending on the culture, that's going to be very different, right?
course. And especially, excuse me, just especially with regard to maybe communicating with children. You know, just I
Interesting.
found it that it make a lot of misunderstanding, especially from children, but maybe we are just standing against them, and we would like to communicate them maybe more emotionally. It's just, I think it makes a lot of misunderstanding in our communication.
And also, so the level, right? If you get down to their level, you know, exactly. Yeah, beautiful. So that Latin kind of interrupting, jumping on each other's sentences, that kind of style would be considered rather aggressive in more high context East Asian cultures. Yep, yeah.
About interrupting, I would like to mention something.
Please.
In some time in the past here in France, we considered interrupting as being very committed to the discussion, passionate about the discussion.
Okay, okay.
So we wouldn't care about people interrupting you, because that would mean they have a great interest in the discussion.
They're very engaged. Yeah.
Recently, I've noticed that younger generation considered interrupting as a sign of disrespect, which is
Wow.
totally opposite. Like the generation of my children are considering interrupting as a high form of disrespect.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting and at the same time very difficult, because you're talking with people the age of your children, and you already have some kind of disruption in the culture, even in the same country.
Fascinating. Wow. So there are these generational differences. It would be interesting to go back to the kind of the environmental factors in the model and find out what are the factors that are influencing that. Were they, you know, was the education a little bit different where they were taught that they were, or was it that they saw this modeled in other cultures and, you know, in America, you know, it would just be very fascinating to find out where did that shift come from. Chris.
The World Council and Darla here have been encouraging us to use a form of intercultural engagement put out by the UN, a storytelling circles process. And I've been using it recently and had a fascinating response from my learners in my current class. About a third of them identify as Japanese international students, and a third of them are first or second generation Latinx students in the US. And so in this process, they each get the floor in a certain sequence, and they get to tell a story, and everyone else is to be quiet and listen intently. And then in the second round, you explain what you believe you learned from each of the participants. In the third round, you explain what it was like to be listened to.
Sure.
And the Japanese students loved being listened to deeply, and the Latinx students hated not interrupting. And they're going back and forth about how this is being held, and I had to take a survey on empathy and a lot of them are working on their deep listening skills. And I can see them really wrestling with when is it correct to interrupt, and because I'm actually showing I approve, and when am I just not really listening to you and adding stuff that's not important. And the differentiation and thinking deeply about listening has caused a real interesting pause, an educational pause, but a pause.
Wow, that is fascinating. How do you signal empathy? You know, how do you build that empathy? Wow, that is just fascinating. Yeah. Huh. So yeah, in East Asian cultures, personal space is between communicators reserved for listening, reflection, respect, and that one suggests might build that empathy. Interestingly, and Wendy has done a lot of research on indigenous cultures, the physical space between two people is communication itself. each party is responsible for what they put into that space, making sure it's the right time and place to release their words, and that the people receiving these words will in turn act responsibly with them. Wow, oh my goodness, such a high context interaction. That is just amazing. And clearly you have to truly understand the norms in that culture to be able to fully take part in that kind of communication. Just fascinating. Okay, so many of you have probably seen this iceberg model of culture. What we would like to suggest is that nonverbal communication, or that specifically context, comes in this very crucial space between the visible culture or verbal communication, right? And the invisible culture, the group values, beliefs, and norms, right, that are rising up. And that then gives rise to nonverbal communication. So groups develop cultural systems that relate to survival, sense of control, and predictability within their physical and social environment. We replicate and reinforce culture through processes of socialization, education, institutional support, and we persist with adaptive behaviors that work for us. Again, the outside environmental forces of the model influencing, coming toward the internal part of the model. Communication context is located at the intersection of hidden values and visible behaviors. And thus there's an opportunity to establish deep connection with others if you can understand the cues in that context. Nonverbal information derives from the communication context, including that which resides within the communicator through emotions, eye contact, body movement, use of sense, silence, etc., and that which resides outside the communicator, the temporal setting, the location, the physical surroundings, the relationship, etc. So if we then look at this process of contextualized communication, we want to go back to the original model of communication that many of us know, right? That you have a sender who encodes a message, which becomes a signal, which is decoded by the receiver, right? And each person is surrounded by their own fields of experience. Now, only if those fields of experience overlap can there be some level of understanding of that signal, right? Such that what was the intention is actually the interpretation. We elaborate on this model and suggest that, okay, so here we are finally getting to the middle of the model, right? The very heart of the model, which is that basic communication model. But the greater the overlap there are in these contexts, and those contexts, right, are influenced by a culture on each side for the sender and the receiver, right? The clearer the understanding of thoughts and ideas. Thus, when you have, and then the sending and receiving of thoughts and ideas occurs more easily and efficiently, and thus there's greater potential for collaboration. But only if there is overlap, right? And that's why all of us work in this field, right? Trying to teach people about culture and understanding so that those people who we talk to can start to increase their overlap, right, with others, so that we can lead to greater understanding and more efficient communication.
May I have a question?
Yes, Mehdi.
Excuse me. Just maybe a great question for me. That would it be a noise from a side, maybe from a decoder or encoder, would be noise considered as a context for just I think that a misunderstanding every time would be happen, and in this case maybe from a side I think maybe just like a time would be context, and from another side would be as a noise, and it comes not to maybe two interpretations on some other.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Is noise just part of the context that's not understood?
Especially
yeah.
maybe when misunderstandings happen, just in
Yes.
this case, maybe a context would be considered as a noise.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you could be right. Yeah. Huh. I mean, you can also think of virtual communications where, imagine someone does an eye roll in a meeting, in an eye roll, at least in the United States, means like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're saying this again or whatever, or what a crazy idea. But in a virtual communication, like we're doing now, maybe I can't see everybody, so I can't see their eye roll, right? That might be a function of noise. So you're right. Sometimes it could be the context in which the communication is occurring. Yeah. Okay, so to sum things up, and we're getting toward the very end here, communication is a manifestation of that cultural context and is itself an expression of culture, be it the ecological, subsistence, socioculture, inter-individual, or individual levels. The communication patterns of each individual will differ depending on, for example, whether they live in close-knit agricultural communities versus in more heterogeneous and autonomous city dwellings, or whether they have an independent or interdependent self-construal. It's quite interesting because my daughter lives in New York City, and she was going to school up on the Upper West Side, and she was living in Harlem a couple years ago. And when she graduated, it was amazing because she came down in her robe, and because we were walking to the graduation site, and people were like, "Oh, congratulations, Emmy, you did it, girl. Oh, good for you." So I was just amazed. I was looking around like, this is crazy. This is New York City. And all these people on the street, people, people who live with her, she lived in an apartment building with many different apartments. It was a real sense of community. Now she lives in Brooklyn. I don't even think she knows all her neighbors in the same building. Right. And so Wendy's going to talk about this, but, you can think about the difference between independent or interdependent self-construals. Right. I would assert that in that largely African-American community up in Harlem, many people had an interdependent self-construal such that it was the group. They looked after one another. The norms of the group, right, were instituted in their communication. Whereas, in Brooklyn, where she lives, everybody just lives in their own little apartment, and they have very independent self-construals. Communicators encode and decode messages in ways that are consistent with their own cultural context and use both verbal and nonverbal means to get their message across. Culturally contextualized communication will typically carry meanings beneath the message and implicit cues based on unwritten scripts and the norms of the communicators. And finally, the extent to which the communicator's fields of experience overlap will determine whether the intended message matches the interpreted one. So let me just show you, we can take questions at the end, but I just want to go on and show you what the full book looks like. So I was now describing our model that was introduced in chapter 2. Chapter 1 really was talking about communication in organizational settings and just kind of setting the stage. And here you can see then in chapter 3, there's more of the theoretical perspective that I was just talking about, communication accommodation theory, and talking about individual level construals. and understanding, the quest for understanding and connection. Then you have effective communication in multicultural teams. How context communicates in cross-cultural negotiation, voice, gossip, and feedback in the global workplace, leading and leadership through nonverbal communication across cultures, exploring workplace incivility and how much of that is nonverbal, what's not being said when communications are virtual, and then we wrap it up. So let me let me just stop sharing here if I can. And we have just a very, very few minutes, but if there are any questions or comments or criticisms or anything you want to share, please do.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation, and it's really informative and insightful for me. Just as maybe as a question, would it be some overlap between the concentration in communication, or maybe attention status, as you mentioned in your presentation, and being in a lower or higher context communication? Would it be some overlap between two concepts? I'm curious about finding more about attention status in communication. Would it be some overlap?
Attention status.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that? Forgive me, I'm not quite clear if I understand your meaning by attention status.
Yes, just in a part of your presentation, you mentioned as attention status, or maybe concentration in communication. As I asked previously ask about maybe concentration as a more important case in communicating between two people, because I think that most of the time we just go to some kind of maybe misunderstanding or misinterpretation, because some people maybe in some case consider a noise as a context, or maybe some controversy. Because of that concentration, would it be maybe playing, for example, playing with the mobile phone?
Sure, I was just thinking the same thing.
In communication would be as a kind of maybe a context for me to show some maybe some non-respectful behavior or interaction.
I gotcha. I got you. And I want to respond to that, but just very quickly, it's 1 o'clock. And I know some people have left already. If anybody else has to leave, thank you so much for being here. We really, really appreciate we really appreciate your
and let me just jump in, Nancy, as well, and then we can continue on with Mede's question. I will send the recording of this session along with the slides after. We have a YouTube channel now, high-low context communication styles, in which we're placing all the videos from this session. As Nancy was mentioning, March 8th is when our partner Wendy Adair will be talking about effective communication in multicultural teams. So please mark your calendar. I'll be reminding everyone about that session. And if you have to leave, please do. Thanks for coming. We will continue with questions. Nancy, go ahead.
Sure. So maybe I think actually Chris might be able to interject on your question, weigh in on that even better than I, just because you were talking about, Chris, at least the connection I made in my mind was you were talking about truly deeply intense listening, right? Versus, listening while I'm looking at my phone. Right. Or versus thinking of how you're going to respond instead of truly listening. Right. So I think you're right. but are those, you know, is a cell phone, is looking at your cell phone when you're talking with someone, a noise, something that contributes to noise? Absolutely, I think, right? Is it
Mhm.
part of the context? I'm not sure, you know, we had a provost who said she would come into meetings and just say, I'm on my phone during the meeting, just so you know, I'm looking at my phone during the meeting, but I'm also listening. It's like, okay. If that's how you want to do it, that's, you know, that was her game.
Yeah. And I would say it's even what we might call generationally bounded. You know,
Yes,
I work with people who have always been tied to their phone.
Yeah.
And the idea that it's not there and that they're not engaging with it means they're not engaged.
right.
And so it's really difficult. I mean, I know people who, particularly in the school age for before college, actually make their students leave their phones in a pocket on the door or in a basket before they come into the classroom. Other faculty that I know work with actually tell their students, pull out your phone and look this up and then send it
Yes.
to my classroom page. I
Yes,
want you engaged with me, and they make them use their phone in the classroom.
absolutely.
So it varies from person to person and context and so forth. But I do think that how we engage with technology and what role we feel it plays is greatly changing a lot of these models, because it is a norm and a value. Again, with my young, I'm doing freshman for the first time and I love it. It's so fun. But the inexperience with direct engagement was
Yes,
mind-blowing to me. But you know, they're just coming out of the pandemic. They were locked in the rooms and interacting with screens. And so when I
Yeah.
put them in small groups and said, now talk to each other, and I'm not going to intervene for 45 minutes. You have 45 minutes to talk to each other. And they were like, what?
yeah. How do we do this?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts or questions, Jan?
Yes, I would like to jump on Chris' subject about relationship with. I'm also a teacher here in France, and what came to my mind is the question that are we free as educators, teachers, to to propose a form of teaching, whatever form it is, or are we prisoners of the cultural of the cultural image the learners have of what they think the teacher should be?
Mhm.
And it's the same idea for management. I've
Yes,
also been, before being a teacher, I've been a business manager, and that's the same. I'm trying to be. I have always been kind of disruptive in my own culture, and I'm facing difficulties because I'm not proposing what is expected as a business owner or as a teacher, and that's difficult. That's kind of weird because I'm trying to propose in some innovative methods, but these are borrowed from other cultures, like
sure.
Anglo American or English, and
Mhm.
so the question is, are we free, or are we prisoners of our learners' culture?
That's really interesting.
Yeah. It's always a challenge, and part of the joy. I know that one of my mentors, a lovely executive coach named George Renwick, would always say, if you've built the trust, you can take your learners anywhere, but you must build the relationship first.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding them, finding out how they want to be related to, what they consider a trusting relationship. And once there's a bond of trust,
Yes,
even for students who, he said, for example, he didn't mind doing simulations where you had to assume a role of somebody different from you. But in certain cultures, the fear of making a mistake in front of other people and
yeah,
playing like
absolutely.
someone would just like, no. But he he didn't do that in the first 45 minutes of meeting them. That was after 10 weeks of building and understanding and the relationship.
Yep.
So when and how you introduce people to things, the sequencing, the trust building, we can violate all sorts of cultural norms once we know that we trust that we all are on the same page. But walking in the door and automatically, you know, with a group of learners who are expecting you to behave one way and automatically behaving totally differently, yeah, they'll write you off in the first 45 minutes. And the same with the manager.
Yeah. And you're right. And then you get into the question of how do you build trust?
Yeah.
Because building trust can differ, you know, culturally, but even generationally, I would assert. So,
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
That's why our work is fun.
it certainly is. And any other questions or comments?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Nancy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I have to buy your book. I don't know why it didn't hit me until today. And I says, why don't I own this book? How stupid
Well, it's
is
not,
that?
you don't own it because it's not out till March. It's
Oh, well,
we're
there
giving you all a
you
preview.
go. But I went on just now, and it's on the Springer site.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
I think it's we're doing the final proofs now. I believe they said end of March. So
okay, well, that's why I don't own it yet. 'Cause, you know,
that's why.
I purposely blur the background because one of my colleagues calls my office Hogwarts on steroids. Sorry, but I collect things. Books are one of them, and I have no fear of that. But anyway, so yours will be one that will be added to.
Wonderful. We'll be in the Hogwarts Emporium. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This was wonderful, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah,
a
thank
great day.
you.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Have a nice evening. Or a nice day.
Yeah. Wonderful
Bye.
weekend.